the title sounds kind of fancy, but it's really not that fancy. When I was trying to figure out what to do for my thesis in college, I was having a lot of trouble, and then I had been doing a lot of urban history research. I was reading a lot about the birth of cities in North America and South America, and I would read articles and they would mention Norfolk, but they would just be like, nah, and then there was this place and nothing really happened. And I was like, whoa, like that can't be, because it's the home of the North Atlantic Fleet. Like, no, like there has to be something to this. And then I got into it deeper, and all I really knew at this point was, oh, there's a cannonball in St. Paul's Episcopal Church. What's the deal with this? And at the same time, I had been watching Outlander, and I was like, all these Scottish people, they're coming to the New World. I bet this has something to do. I'm going to connect the dots. So I got deep into the roots of the economics of the early American Republic. And it turns out that Norfolk was a big deal, and we could have been like Baltimore. So to start out, Norfolk had a rise in the early 18th century that was not really experienced by other cities of its size. So like Charleston or Newport, because obviously we can't compare it to New York and Philadelphia. Those are really big cities. They always were. And in the post-revolutionary period, the populations, the types of business, they're just different. But Charleston and Baltimore, you can really compare. So the other issue with the southern port cities in historical studies is that people don't really care about the southern cities. But the southern cities are important too, because this is where tobacco, grain, indigo, a lot of important things were happening here. So you have to look at it as, how are we going to position Norfolk in terms of studying cities in the South? So my niche became, why is there a lack of focus on urban centers in the South? And in particular, why is there a lack of research about Norfolk in the Chesapeake region? So I started focusing on two parts: the rise and then what it became. I also was coming at it from the point where I went to Norfolk Academy, as Peggy told you, and they're constantly talking about how they were chartered in 1728. And I was like, okay, this is way before the Revolution, but I knew that they didn't actually start having classes until later on. And I knew from my research that to have a school like that is a really big deal in the colonial era. It means you have a really large merchant community, you have the money, the infrastructure, the roads to get people there, because that's a really big deal. And so if the definition of a functional city, what do you have? It's not just looking at demographics, which is how people define New York and Philadelphia in this time period. So first, Norfolk became a major area for grain because tobacco didn't grow well here. But they experienced crop diversification, as well as an influx of Scottish immigrants at the same time. So you had native planters, native people who had been in the borough of Norfolk since the 1600s. But then people coming in as factors of these agencies in London and in Edinburgh, and they're bringing a lot of vibrancy to the community. 3 really important things happened at the same time. Those are the first 2. And then the second is the change in shipping. Before, there were smaller boats, and they were going up the rivers, filling up with the crops, and coming back to Norfolk and filling up ships and then leaving. Around 1750, shipping completely changed along the Atlantic coast. You have large ships. Norfolk is prime for those ships to come in. And you no longer have people able to go up the river system. So everybody has to bring all of their stuff to Norfolk. Trade is bustling. You start having more wharfs, more merchants, people called vendue masters. They were kind of like auctioneers. They would take surplus goods and sell them, but they also would finance things. The research is a little sketchy on them because they're a little controversial. So this is a map of Norfolk from 1680 to 1736, showing like the wharfs, the different plots of land, and the scale of it. And so like when I talk about Norfolk and then the eventual burning, Norfolk County includes like Poplar Hall, like stuff way out. When they talk about Norfolk being burned, it's really this area. So when I say like 99% of Norfolk was burned, it's this, because this is where trade was, this is where business was, this is where the Freemason Society was, St. Paul's, but it was called Borough Church, the Gosport shipyard across the river, the rope walk, taverns, and people would come and study it because this is where everything was happening for the whole region. And it was a big deal in Williamsburg too, because this is how they would get their stuff. So it became a trade entrepot for the hinterland and the region. It was the largest city in Virginia at the time, and it was experiencing kinetic growth. So with the entrance of the Scottish merchant community in the 1740s, it shifted Norfolk's place within the British Atlantic coast and allowed for its economic and physical growth. What I was arguing that was different than before was that the Scottish community was a catalyst for Norfolk's growth. And I did a lot of research on the personal papers of some different merchants. This is a map showing circa 1776, pretty much the same, but like the swamp. You can see Norfolk County, Princess Anne County. So the other thing that happened was the customs house was in Hampton, and people started to argue about the fact that this makes no sense. Why is the customs house in Hampton and all the ships are coming into Norfolk, and we have to get on these tiny little boats, sail over to Hampton. There's time for people to steal things. There's time for people to change the documents. There's a lot of smuggling issues. So right before the Revolution, 1770, the Royal Customs Inspector from Boston came down and did a whole report. And this was like a huge primary source for me because it proved that Norfolk was a big deal. And if the Royal Customs Inspector is coming down like you got something going on. So this is a quote from his report. Entering the harbor, vessels would proceed directly to Norfolk. The masters leaving their vessels there return the next or perhaps the same day to the customs house at Hampton, 18 miles across the road. They enter their vessels in such part of their cargoes as they think proper, all which were usually landed within the least control or inspection of any officer, and no doubt, but some of the vessels had been discharged before the masters returned from Hampton. They load in the same manner without any kind of check and obtain a clearance as Hampton as they proceed outwards on their voyages. So there was a lot of room for error. Thank you to, I can't remember who made this, but this map that somebody made in 2005 from the Norfolk Historical Society was really helpful to me when I was writing this during COVID. So I really appreciate it. This is from 1802, but it points out the built environment, the things that are important to the definition of a city in terms of this type of study. Distilleries and taverns, the church, the grammar school, the Freemason chapter, and the shipyard and the rope walk. The distilleries and taverns are a big deal because they served as community and an unofficial merchant association. There was one merchant named Neil Jameson, and he had come from Scotland, and he ended up being a loyalist, but he survived the revolution and ended up staying in New York. He did not go back to England. He created a distillery. It morphed into a merchant association for the Chesapeake region, and it was big politically in the revolution leading up to it, what to do about what was going on in Williamsburg, and it proved to be one of the reasons that I talk about later. Richard Henry Lee referred to Norfolk as a hotbed of Tories in his letter to George Washington, which was detrimental to Norfolk's reputation within the Continental Congress and the political arena when it came to rebuilding. These are three merchants, big players in Norfolk leading up to the Revolution. Charles Stewart, he was very wealthy, really engrossed in the community, and he ended up going back to England, and he died over there and managed to make out okay following the revolution, but he lost a lot of property and his whole business and had to completely start over. James Parker is a really interesting case because he epitomizes the Scottish merchant who really came to Norfolk with nothing and built a whole career and a life for himself. And if it hadn't been for the burning of Norfolk and the Revolution, he probably would have stayed here and made a big difference. He came here at 18 years old in 1747, and he was working for the Glasgow trader Alexander Spears. He stayed in the region, and in 1760, he married into the Tidewater establishment, which was a really big deal because he's merging the native community with the Scottish community. He married Margaret Elgood, the daughter of Jacob Elgood, a prominent planter whose ties to the region reached back to 1627. Shortly after, Parker entered into a business partnership with his brother-in-law, William Aitchison. Together, they established roots, and by 1775, Parker was well established in the Norfolk merchant community. He owned land in town, he owned land in Northampton County, and in Currituck County in North Carolina. People like Parker, who arrived at mid-century, were able to establish themselves within the business community and the local governing establishment. His brother-in-law, William Aitchison, served in a number of public offices beginning in 1759. He was Justice of the Peace for Norfolk County, Borough Alderman, and Norfolk Representative in the House of Burgesses. They were not part of Neil Jameson's distillery that I spoke about before, and that's where I believe we start to see political ties breaking. So, Carter Braxton was another merchant in Norfolk. I don't know as much about him. I want to do more research about him, but he's mentioned in a lot of letters with Charles Stewart, Lieutenant Governor Barkware, and I think his story says a lot about the type of people that were here and proves that the community in Norfolk was just as sophisticated as it was in New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Newport. So over here we have Richard Henry Lee. He proposed independence in the Continental Congress. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie 1776, but he has a really good song in there. And he wrote to George Washington on the eve of Revolution, "We must endeavor to draw good out of evil. You will no doubt have heard of the disgraceful conduct of Norfolk in suffering Lord Dunmore with a few men to take away their printing press. Virginia is much incensed, and 500 men are ordered immediately down to Norfolk. I expect by every post to hear of the demolition of that infamous nest of Tories." So the reputation was not good. Dunmore came down to Norfolk. He was beginning his gunboat diplomacy, cannons aimed at Norfolk, and people did not put up a fight. They were kind of like, maybe we could make this work for ourselves. There were a lot of people who were angry because he issued his proclamation to free the slaves, huge loss of property. So a lot of the planters, not a lot of the people who were in the city area would have really cared about that. That would have been people in the greater county area. So a lot of the people in Norfolk, the Scottish merchants, the people who are important to the argument, would have been like, well, it could be good for us politically if we side with him. It could be good for us economically. We could maybe leave. It might work. Dunmore was here. He left. There was the Battle of Great Bridge, the Battle of Kemp's Landing. He came back because strategically Norfolk was super important. And both sides knew that, and both sides did not want the other side to have it. Very famous picture of Dunmore looking very Scottish. The English love to dress up like Scots and say they really care about the Scottish people. And then this is Robert Howe. He was one of two people in charge of the Continental Army defending Norfolk. And he felt very strongly that they should protect Norfolk at all costs. But it ended up that he was not able to control his men. So, let's see. Wait, that's the fire. Unfortunately, the revolutionary movement caught Norfolk at its peak and threatened to destroy the prosperity of the booming economy that had been developing for the past 40 years. And it burned. This is a drawing actually from the mid-1800s of recollection of the burning of Norfolk. And then this is a quote from Colonel Howe that he wrote in the middle of the burning, because it began January 1st, 1776, and it lasted until January 3rd or 4th. Under cover of their guns, they landed and set fire to the town in several places near the water, the British. Though our men strove to prevent them all in their power, but the houses near the water, being chiefly of wood, they took fire immediately, and the fire spread with amazing rapidity. It has now become general, and the whole town will, I doubt not, be consumed in a day or two. And it was. 99% of all of the built structures were gone. The only building, as probably many of you know, that was left was St. Paul's Church, and that was not great because people lost everything. They lost their livelihood, and all the community was gone. So people had no choice but to go to a different city, or go, if they were siding with the British, go back to England. It was really hard for people to file claims for their property because of the reputation that Norfolk had garnered in those years leading up to 1776. And it wasn't until 1800 to 1803 that significant buildings started to reappear. So these tables show the population before and after, and also, even though there are other ways to describe property, I think this is really interesting way to show it with the number of slaves that people had, because you can see that the number of households without any slaves living in the city was 500. That's a lot of people living in that area that are just your normal day-to-day people working in Norfolk, working at the wharves, working at the rope walk. But then you have 128 people with 3 to 5. That's a big deal. That shows a lot of wealth. And not a lot of other places on the East Coast are experiencing that kind of wealth during this time. And you can see that Baltimore only had 5,934 people in 1775. Norfolk had 6,250. Savannah, which is featured heavily in a lot of research about colonial cities and cities in the early 19th century, only had 3,200 people, and unfortunately they missed out on the census in 1790, so I guess we'll never know. But it's interesting to see that, like, Newport, 11,000 people in 1775. They only had like 6,800 people in 1790. Newport is not as important of a city economically in the 19th century or even now as Norfolk. So why is there more scholarship on Newport than Norfolk? Charleston, Baltimore, Savannah. It's, in terms of these cities, which are all studied more, I think Norfolk is more important and shows that there's a lot of growth happening in this pre-revolutionary period, and it really begs the question, what happened and why were they not able to rebuild in a way that they could continue in their trajectory? In terms of other cities burning in the Revolution, no other city faced the level of destruction that Norfolk did. New York is another fire that's talked about a lot. They only lost 10% of their buildings. They were able to rebuild. Their banking community was able to stay and finance things. There wasn't a mass exodus of people. So by January 3rd, 900 houses were gone, and after 3 days of burning, it was discovered, but not talked about until 1777, that 863 of the buildings had been destroyed by the American people and the Continental Army, and only 19 had been destroyed by the British. All this time, the House of Burgesses had been under the impression that the damage was done by Dunmore, and it wasn't until they did the official report that they realized what had really happened. The people in Norfolk who were forced to flee were angry at their former loyalist neighbors. They were angry at the Scottish merchant community, and they petitioned, having been uniformly active in promoting the measures recommended by the General Congress and Convention for the preservation and defense of their rights and liberties. In consequence of this conduct, many of them had been reduced to the cruel necessity of abandoning their aged parents, their wives and children, and leaving them to the mercy of a lawless, plundering soldiery and the more savage slave, that their plantations had been ravaged, that they lamented the tardy and equivocal conduct of some of their lukewarm friends, by which Lord Dunmore had been encouraged to begin these depredations. Dunmore continued to commit so long with impunity that whilst our troops kept possession of Norfolk, they enjoy a state of safety, and praying the strict inquiry might be made into the conduct of those who had appeared inadmissible to this country, and that they might be removed to some distant part of the colony, or so disposed of as they prevent their doing further mischief, and earnestly recommending that the slaves who had borne arms should be transported to West India. So family, property, and capital were lost as a result, and there was a lot of anger at attempts to rebuild, and it didn't go as some had hoped. So, in closing, Norfolk retained all the qualities to be a prominent port town in the context of the 18th century. When we use the functional definition of a city, Norfolk qualifies as a city, despite not having large populations like New York and Philadelphia. They had a strong government structure, a port, an upper and a middle class supporting the local economy, but it doesn't get the attention that I think it deserves. Unlike Baltimore, which grew to a post-war population of 13,503, in 1790, Norfolk's population decreased dramatically. And I think because its growth stagnated, it's been written off in terms of urban history. But like I said, no other colonial city faced the destruction on the scale. And I think that even though we have this pseudo-revival that took place in the early 1800s, some thought maybe we could be a rival to Boston, but this never materialized. The detrimental hit to their business and merchant community during the war meant a loss of physical and monetary capital. But we can't deny that Norfolk rose to become one of the most significant ports in the British Atlantic Empire through the advantages of location, the most convenient port for those exporting to the West Indies, and the commodities they were capable of exporting: timber, tobacco, and later large quantities of grain. Its harbor in a prime location just off the Chesapeake Bay, optimal size and depth for the larger vessels of the late 18th century, meeting the needs of the growing European market. Economic success drew a level of sophistication to the port, and Norfolk became the most important Virginian city. Unfortunately, Norfolk's greatest benefit, the location, ease, and safety of its harbor, contributed to its demise. The government who had jurisdiction over Norfolk would reap great benefits, but it was difficult to protect, and neither the British nor the Continental government wanted the other party to have control, so the strategic port burned. The citizens and the economy suffered great loss, but the greatest defeat in the burning of Norfolk was the legacy itself. Southern port towns of the colonial era provided an important foundation for future urban footprints. Norfolk should not be overlooked in urban history because it had a smaller population than traditional ports, and for not experiencing the same trajectory as Charleston or Baltimore following the Revolution. The devastation which occurred in 1776 halted the progression of a growing provincial economy and southern urban development. It was not the falling price of tobacco, geographic misfortune, or the lack of native merchants which led to Norfolk's fall, but rather the burning of the town. Before the Revolution, Norfolk was a contender to become one of the most important colonial cities, and unfortunately, the burning altered its economic fate and its place in urban history. But, as we all know, Norfolk should not be remembered for what and why it did not become, but for the colonial prosperity experience and the role it served in the beginning of this country. St. Paul's, and even though it's a later Norfolk Academy, but that's it. Thank you.